Psalm 29 is sung on Friday night, and Carl is going to sing for us the sounds of Psalm 29.
Havul Adonai v'nei, Havul Adonai kavod va'oz, Havul Adonai kevod shemo, Yishtachavu Adonai b'havrato, Kol Adonai al hamay, El hakavod kirim, Adonai Almighty, Almighty, Rabbi.
Thank you, Carl. That's the melody that we use on Friday night. It keeps going. But just some thoughts to introduce this psalm with that melody. One is the key reminder that psalms are songs, that they were poems meant to be sung, both for the enhanced ability to remember the poems, but even more for the enhanced ability to express the emotions contained in the psalm. And so Psalm 29 has many melodies, and it's an integral part of our Shabbat prayers. And I'll look to share with you a greater understanding that came out of researching this psalm, one of the psalms that I could sing by heart, but have never taken the time to really analyze. The very beginning, the two verses that Carl began with, a Psalm of David, accord to Adonai godlike beings, accord to Adonai glory and power, accord to Adonai the glory due the divine name, bow before Adonai in the splendor of holiness. The voice of Adonai is upon the waters. The God of glory thunders. Adonai is upon vast waters. That introduction points to a very ancient poem. There's a poetic technique called incremental repetition that is part of the Song of Deborah, the repeating and building, which you have here in verses 1 and 2. Havu, accord or give to Adonai godlike beings, give to Adonai glory and power, give to Adonai. So that quality of repetition that is building is part of Ugaritic poetry. That's the poetry of Babylonia, of Sumeria, of antiquity. And there are some Bible scholars who see this as, to a great degree, a Ugaritic poem. But as we'll see, the punchline is very different. The adaptation is different, though the poetic techniques may overlap and even be derived. There's another thing in that very beginning, and that is the first line, accord to Adonai b'nei Elim, God-like beings. It's a phrase we have before in the Bible, but not often, and it also points to the antiquity of this particular psalm. What is a child, literally, of the gods, b'nei Elim? In Ugaritic poetry, there was the notion of many gods, of polytheism. And so Robert Alter will say, in this regard, sons of God, flickering afterlife of a polytheistic mythology, referring to God's royal entourage on high. And already the early translation, the Targum, the translation into Aramaic, will translate B'nai Elim as the angels, the familia, the court of God. Verse 3 will begin a repetition 7 times of a phrase, Kol Adonai, the voice of God. And the first one, verse 3, which was just sung, the voice of Adonai is upon the waters. The God of glory thunders. Adonai is upon vast waters. That echoes the story of creation, where in verse 2 of Genesis chapter 1, we have Veruach Elohim, and the Spirit of God, Merachefet al Hamayim, was fluttering over the waters or hovering on the waters. And verses 3 to 9 represent God's voice. It could be the voice of creation, beginning again with that image of God over the waters, or it could be a storm that moves remarkably from the west to the north. Verse 5, the cedars of Lebanon. The verse 6, Lebanon and Sirion, which is Mount Hermon in the north border of today's Israel and Lebanon. And then moving south, the storm, you can hear the voice of God as a experience of a powerful, noisy storm that the Psalter is reacting to, because it moves from west to north, and Kadesh in verse 8 is the south. And then it moves in verse 9 east toward the palace. And so verses 3 to 9, with this repetition of 7 times the voice of God, is a display of God's power in and over nature, with a dramatic shift in verses 10 and 11. The dramatic shift is toward calm. Adonai sat enthroned as at the flood. Adonai is enthroned as supreme God forever, which is the expanse of time and calm. And in contrast to the opening of this psalm, which have all these people praising God, be they angels or they being referred to us. You see, some of the early commentators, like Rashi, would say, who are the godlike beings? That's us at Mount Sinai. What does it mean, godlike beings? It means the beings of the ancestors of power, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So there are 3 ways this psalm is read. One, as a description of a storm and a reaction of praise of God's might. The second is a psalm that describes acts of creation. And the third, particularly emphasized by Rashi, is that this is a description of revelation at Mount Sinai. And the repeated voice is the voice of God speaking Torah. And so when it says at the end, verse 11, may Adonai give power to God's people, the power that's being referred to is the gift of Torah for Rashi. May Adonai bless God's people with peace. And the last thing I'll look to comment on is how the 18 repetition of Yud Hey Vav Hey in this psalm points for the rabbis, like Rashi, to the composition of the central prayer, the Amidah, with 18 blessings, or the 7 times that Kol Adonai is mentioned points to the 7 blessings of the Shabbat Amidah. So Psalm 29 will also be used as a guide to prayer and in the Talmud, and I'll come back to that. But before I continue, let me read the poem with my translation, and I will add one last minute change. And again, I thank Eric for his ability to make these last minute changes. And that is, there's a inclusio, the opening and closing is, we've seen in Psalms, provide an envelope, often with a key word. And the key word here is the last word of verse 1, Oz, and you'll see Oz as the second word in verse 11. The Oz in the beginning, Oz is literally strength, but I chose to translate it because there's no exact word for the ability to affect change. A political consultant once defined power for me as the ability to affect change. And that's an aspect of strength. And this is a poem about God's ability to affect change in nature, potentially to affect change through the giving of Torah, the ability to affect change through the power of a storm. And so here I distinctly translated O's as power, as the inclusio. And one last thing in terms of the flow of this is a psalm of great movement, where there's the sense again of this power, this storm moving. One of the contemporary Bible scholars, Brueggemann, refers to this psalm as a remarkable display of that quality of power and movement. And yet, here's the great contrast. Contrast again, verses 1 to 2 is an introduction with Havu. Verses 3 to 9 is this quality of movement. And then 10 and 11, we have God enthroned, God sitting, conveying calm, ending in the word peace, by God's self, as if God is alone, whether in the throne above or within the world, enabling a quality of peace, pointing to also to why this psalm is identified as a psalm of Shabbat. So more to share in terms of analysis, but first now to read the psalm from beginning to end, to get a feel for that flow, to get a feel for the three components, verses 1 to 2, 3 to 9, and then 10 and 11. A psalm of David. Accord to Adonai godlike beings, accord to Adonai glory and power, accord to Adonai the glory due the divine name, bow before Adonai in the splendor of holiness. The voice of Adonai is upon the waters. The God of glory thunders. Adonai is upon vast waters. The voice of Adonai is in power. The voice of Adonai is in splendor. The voice of Adonai breaks cedars. Adonai shatters the cedars of Lebanon, makes Lebanon dance like a calf, Syrian like a young wild ox. The voice of Adonai kindles flames of fire. The voice of Adonai makes the wilderness tremble. Adonai makes tremble the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of Adonai brings on birth pangs of does and strips the forest bare. And in the palace, all proclaim glory. Adonai sat enthroned at the flood. Adonai is enthroned as supreme guide forever. May Adonai give power to God's people. May Adonai bless God's people. Vashalom, with peace. There's another major shift in the journey of this psalm, where the God that's described is the God of overnature, universal, and yet it leads to the God of the people of Israel, a particular quality of God within the world. And so there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of journey in this particular psalm. Let me just show you a couple things at the very beginning of the psalm that the rabbis comment on, and that is verses 1 and 2 are seen in the Talmud as pointing to the opening blessings of the Amidah prayer. Havu l'Adonai b'nei Elim, let us or accord to Adonai, godlike beings, b'nei Elim. For the rabbis is not necessarily can be angels, but it is also the Israelites whose ancestors were mighty. So again, the word El in Hebrew is the universal name of an authority figure, a source of power. In Canaanite, El is also the name of God. And so it's the children of might. That's how it's also translated. That's the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for they were mighty in their faith and in their relationship with God. And that is identified in the Talmud as the first blessing of the Amidah, in which we say, praised are you who defends Abraham. The second line, Havud Ladonai Kavod Va'oz, is praises God, whose glory and power is identified with the second blessing of the Amidah, which is where we acknowledge that God has the power to awaken the dead, power over life and death. That's the ultimate power, to be able to create and give life. The second verse says, let us bow before God in the splendor of holiness. And elsewhere in the Talmud, Brachot 30b, that's identified with the third blessing of the Amidah, that of the Kedusha. And so that's another layer to how this psalm resonated for the rabbis as a description of how one would pray to God, and that the blessings of what becomes the central prayer are given over in this psalm to us as where we should likewise be headed when we seek to praise God. Some additional just little comments, and that is the cedars of Lebanon. They, of course, are the mighty trees, some of the strongest trees, and those were the same trees used for the building of the temple in the description. And so again, this points as well to a future unfolding. The imagery of nature dancing, Lebanon dancing like a calf, the mountains, Syrian dancing like a young wild ox, is this quality of animation in nature in which all is created by God and all responds by praise of God, and that the world is animated. That's also a kind of early layer of all religions, the sense that all of nature is infused with a quality of awareness that is alive and responsive to God. The verse 7, the voice of Adonai kindles flames of fire. For Rashi, the great commentator of France of the 11th century, this is specifically about Mount Sinai, as is this entire psalm for him, as there was thunder and lightning at Mount Sinai as part of Revelation. And as at Mount Sinai, everything trembled. So verse 8, as the Torah was given in the desert, so verse 8, and out of that can come, verse 9, new beginnings. Things being stripped bare so as to give birth to life. Rashi also asks why this image of the birth pangs of the doe being brought forth. And this is more of an aside, but he says that a doe has a very narrow birth canal, and that the fright of the thunder, of the lightning of this moment creates those kinds of contractions that even for a doe allows for an easy birthing. The key word that appears in Psalms often is this word glory, kavod. You'll see it appearing 4 times in this psalm. It's verse 1, it's in verse 2, it's in verse 3, We identify glory with God, and we see it as the final word in verse 9, which then creates the bridge. This word kavod, repeated over and over, to the close, which is the quality of calm of God seated on God's throne in verses 10 and 11. Part of the movement of this psalm is a result of repeated words. Havo, havu, kavod, Adonai, 18 times, with a sense again of transition on a variety of levels. And with this, I will pull together this description of vocal power of God moving toward calm. An opening in which we are invited to do things simultaneously with these different commentaries, not necessarily a choice of one over the other as right, but facets of an experience. We might envision this psalm as a response to hearing God's power through a storm, and the movement and the sense of nature's might, God's might as the creator, might be part of what is the prompt for these words. It might be simultaneously the image of that leads to the image of creator, and that movement of God going through the days of creation, beginning with water, and then with fire, and then with earth, with trees. Rashbam, Rashi's grandson, says that the 5 days of creation are presented here in preparation for the creation of humanity on day 6. And last, this psalm can be seen as a description of revelation. And in Revelation, God is given over to a show of might, of thunder and lightning, and the word, the Kol Adonai, the voice of Adonai, repeated 7 times. But ultimately, in that description of revelation, as the rabbis describe it, after all at Mount Sinai of thunder and lightning and the sound of the shofar, pervading silence. And only in that still small voice of silence is God's voice ultimately heard. The last word of the psalm is the word shalom. And I mentioned the links between this psalm and the Musaf prayer, the Amidah with 7 blessings that is to come. That Amidah prayer will end with the word shalom, as will the Kaddish prayer right after that. And so the final word here is the end of the journey of creation, of power, of movement toward a quality where all is harmonized, integrated, and is at peace. With that, I just wanted to invite, because it's such a treat for me to have Carl with us, to do the other melody for Psalm 29. And that's the one for Saturday when we carry the Torah around the sanctuary. Remember those days? And people reach out to touch the Torah. This is the psalm that we sing. Also, just the first 3 lines would be great.
Avul Adonai v'neilu, Avul Adonai kavod va'od, Avul Adonai kevod shemo, Ishtachavu Adonai ve'advat kodesh, Kol Adonai amai, El hakavod irim, amayim, amayim, amayim.
With that, thank you, Carl. I would like to open it up now for 5 minutes to see if people had an experience or an awareness in looking at this psalm more closely as to its nature and power, or a question that you might have in looking at it.
I would say this, Rabbi, that tomorrow night, when we sing this together, I'm going to look in musical terms to decrescendo for the last 2 verses and give it, the treatment that I use for most of it is kind of a powerful, aggressive setting musically. But I'm going to come in for a smooth landing for the last 2 verses, as now that I understand the piece that it conjures up. So look for that tomorrow night. Everyone tune in and hold me to that.
So I just want to build on that awareness that Carl is sharing, that he's going to bring into how he presents this musically. And that is, until I prepared this psalm, I didn't see it as the journey that it is. This journey through thunder and lightning and all of this motion, verses 3 to 9, displaying God's power. And on Friday night, it's chosen because Shabbat is a reminder of God as creator. And in that regard, we're celebrating God as creator on Friday night. On Saturday, we're celebrating God as the giver of Torah, which is, again, the other way of reading this psalm. But in either case, there's a sense of movement and motion, Mount Sinai, thunder and lightning, that leads to, as here, the last 2 lines, calm and even silence. Ahuva, I saw you put something into the chat. Would you open your mic and share it? Ahuva?
Yes, what I noticed is the word plays in this psalm. The first one is the play on the root hul or chil. I don't have it in front of me, but which means to fear and to dance. And then egel and rakad also is to dance, to create a circle to dance. So there's a lot of dancing there, movement of dancing. The second one is the first verse is kavod va'oz. I think it is called Hendiadis. The first kavod is focused, the first verses of kavod, and then the oz, it ends the psalm in the end, the last verse. So it's like wrapping it with the description of God himself.
Thank you for emphasizing how, again, the Psalter as artist creates repetition of words and repetitions of sounds.
And movement.
And movement that all together and in different ways keep this psalm moving.
Yeah, it's like nature. Nature moves, nature dances. Nature responds to God's glory.
That's beautiful. That the way that we respond to acknowledging and praising God's glory is through dance. Back to the Song of the Sea, there's the image of Miriam taking the timbre and not only singing, but dancing. And
also, one more point is you talked about the sound of God, Kol Adonai. And this is, you can compare it with the experience of Elijah on Mount Horeb.
Which there too, to emphasize this moment of epiphany,
right,
parallel to Mount Sinai,
yeah,
in that it's actually, Mount Horeb is also identified with Mount Sinai, so that Elijah is going to the place of revelation, and there in the description is all of this sound of God's thunder, and then kol demama daka, this thin, small voice, which is when Elijah finally hears God's voice, not in the thunder, not in all the sound, but in the silence. And here, back to this being a psalm of revelation, and that's why we carry the Torah at the end of the Torah singing this song, is it resonates with those previous images of revelation in Exodus 19 and 20, and Elijah also on Mount Sinai. And we, when we take the Torah out of the ark and when we return it, are prompted to see ourselves in that moment of God's presence of revelation. And so that's beautifully said, bringing in that other image, which is to pull all this together. When the Psalter is writing this psalm, as all of our psalms, there are many things going on. There are associations of other biblical moments, whether the image of God hovering over the water or the sounds of Sinai and the sounds of silence. And simultaneously, there's an artistry of echoes, of movement, of images, of dance, of the world, the mountains dancing, all in celebration of God, that leads to both silence and more. For the rabbis, points to what we're supposed to do next, which is 7 times bless God in the Shabbat Amidah, corresponding to the Kol of Adonai here repeated 7 times, and in that prayer, ending with the acknowledgement of Shalom as the target of God's creation and God's presence enabling of Shalom. So Psalm 29, it's a pleasure to unpack it, to share it, to hear it. Again, I want to thank Carl Cedar with his name being part of this psalm as well. So it's appropriate to have shared Psalm 29 together today. Next week, 30, 31, and 32. If there are any among us who need to say Kaddish, I invite you to do so now, and for us to have the mitzvah of answering Amen. Yitkadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Yoma Divrach Yirtei V'yamlich Malchutei. V'chayehon v'yamechon v'yamechon Beit Yisrael. Va'agalah Isman Kari V'imru Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabba V'torah Le'olam Olam Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitpa'ar V'yitromam V'yitnaseh V'yitadar V'yitaleh V'yitalal Shemei Dekushka V'rifu Le'elah Min Kol Birchata V'shirata Tushbechata V'nechemata Damiran V'alma V'imru Amen. Yehei Shema Rabba Min Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu V'yal Yisrael V'imru Amen. Oseh Shalom V'imramav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu V'yal Yisrael V'yosrei Tevel V'imru Amen. My gratitude to each of you for tuning in. I wish you all, as we look forward to Shabbat beginning tomorrow night, do tune in to listen to how Carl sings Psalm 29, perhaps a little differently at the end. Again, thank you for sharing in this learning. Shabbat Shalom.